Ladies and gentlemen, good morning wherever you are in the virtual universe. Today we are here to celebrate a pioneer, a champion of youth work and youth development in the region and indeed internationally. So it is by no accident that today the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies, SALISES, on the St. Augustine campus of the University of the West Indies, in partnership with the Commonwealth Secretariat, it's no accident that we have come together to host this very important webinar to celebrate the life and the work completed by our brother, Dr. Henry Charles. Dr. Henry Charles has been dubbed the godfather of youth development work in the Caribbean. Dr. Henry Charles has been dubbed as a gentle giant, and indeed, despite his posture, he was indeed very gentle, a gentle giant indeed. And his contribution to Caribbean society will be greatly missed due to his loss. He passed on the 8th of July, 2023, and it was a great loss to the Caribbean region and indeed the globe, as you will hear from the various presentations in terms of the quality of work he delivered. So, as the acting director of the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies, I take great pleasure in welcoming each and every one of you to this webinar. SALISES St. Augustine has been known for organizing what has been popularly recognized as the SALISES Virtual Forum, a series of webinars of which this is the 19th that SALISES St. Augustine has been associated with. And we are pleased to bring all of these events and the myriad issues of social, economic, and cultural significance, not only to the Caribbean region, but in many instances globally as well. I think, by virtue of what we have done over the past 2 years, we have really emphasized the value of SALISES and all of its partners whom we have associated with to ensure that you are treated with these professional and highly sensitive issues, and of course, with great delight that is appealing more or less to the intellect. So we are very happy to be associated with these events. I have known Dr. Henry Charles for at least 11 years. I first met him when he was in charge of the Commonwealth Youth Program for the Caribbean, headquartered in Georgetown, Guyana. And since then, I became closely associated professionally with his work and, of course, his chair. I have enjoyed several occasions with Dr. Charles, whether we were talking about youth development work, youth work generally speaking, whether we were talking about cricket, West Indies cricket, or Caribbean politics, calypsos, and the list goes on, Caribbean popular culture, and the list goes on. And I'm sure I'm not the only one in this forum, in this virtual space, who would have encountered Dr. Henry Charles in such ways. Several of us have been delighted by his presence and have really admired him in terms of his breadth of knowledge on a wide range of issues over and beyond his pet concerns with youth development and youth work. I have sat with Dr. Charles in several quarters. I have sat with him in meetings in Marlborough House, London, in various conference centers, whether in Kingston, Jamaica, Georgetown, Guyana, Belize City, in Belize, and even right here in Port of Spain, Trinidad. Dr. Henry Charles was a dear colleague. And I think the mere fact that we are here today to celebrate the life of Dr. Henry Charles attests to the fact that he served well, particularly in the Commonwealth Secretariat. As I mentioned before, he was the director, the head of the Caribbean, the Commonwealth Youth Program headquartered in Georgetown, Guyana, overseeing all of the Caribbean region and its activities with respect to youth work and youth development. And beyond his stint as the head of the Commonwealth Youth Program, he also worked tirelessly with the Commonwealth Secretariat in advancing many of their global agendas to serve the more than 50 Commonwealth member states. So the Commonwealth Secretariat has really lost a champion, someone who was dedicated to the cause of young persons and someone who sought to enrich lives of human populations and improve standards as they prevail in myriad institutions that look after the well-being of young people and by extension, human populations. Young people really become the leaders at some point in time if they are not already leaders in their own right. He championed the notion of a voice for young persons and equity at tables wherever decision-making took place. In the context of SALISES, Dr. Henry Charles was a recently minted PhD, obtaining his PhD from SALISES St. Augustine in 2021. And SALISES St. Augustine, SALISES Regional, and the University of the West Indies as a whole are indeed proud of this alumnus of the institute, of the institution. We are indeed proud of his professional accomplishments, even before he obtained his PhD, because as I would have said previously, the PhD was just a rite of passage to confirm an honor and a status that we already knew was characteristic of the being of Dr. Henry Charles. So Dr. Henry Charles has also been, quite apart from his stint at the Commonwealth Secretariat, integrally associated with the University of the West Indies and SALISES St. Augustine in particular. Dr. Henry Charles taught in the Department of Sociology and Social Work in the University of the West Indies. He was a key player in a new postgraduate program on child and youth studies. And I am quite convinced, based on my engagement with a number of the students who have participated in his classes, that he will be sorely missed. I can attest to his commitment to several causes. As I mentioned, we hosted this webinar for the past 2 years, and on several occasions, he was a regular member of the virtual audience. Additionally, he was a presenter in a recent forum, which we hosted in October last year, when we spoke specifically about, how the Trinidad and Tobago budget and dealt with issues pertaining to young people. And he brought the perspective of young persons to inform the discussion around Trinidad and Tobago's national budget 2022-2023 during that forum. So many of you can actually find that forum on our website and actually witness firsthand the kind of mind that occupied the physique of Dr. Henry-Charles. Recently, SALISES hosted a conference on the 50th anniversary of the Black Power Revolution, and Dr. Henry-Charles was one of our go-to persons in terms of ensuring that we were properly anchored in as far as our focus on critical issues, and he was extremely instrumental in bringing to the fore the youth participation in that event. There are many more glorious statements I can make about the life of our comrade, Dr. Henry-Charles. Some folks know him as Comrade Charlo. And there are many more glorious statements I can make about his life. But at this point, I think I will wind up because we have assembled a highly esteemed panel of 5 persons, in fact, 6 persons, including the widow of Dr. Henry-Charles, and each of them will, of course, enlighten you and enlighten us of, the great work that has been associated with the life of Dr. Henry-Charles. So I don't want to hold up the proceedings any longer, and I thank each and every one of you for joining our webinar this morning. I would like to end and turn you over to Mr. Lane Robinson, the head of the Social Policy Development Unit at the Commonwealth Secretariat in London. Mr. Lane Robinson will assume the role of the chairperson of today's proceedings, and I want to invite Mr. Robinson to begin the webinar. Thank you very much all for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Godfrey St. Bernard, for your welcome and your opening remarks, as well as your leadership in pulling this webinar together, including this very special one in honor of Dr. Henry-Charles. It is my honor to join you from the Secretariat, the Commonwealth Secretariat here in London, and particularly also given that I think Dr. Henry-Charles would have been very pleased to know that we are having this kind of intellectual discussion that would help to uplift and put some ideas together around the way forward for youth development across the world. So let me thank you again, Dr. St. Bernard, and the whole SALISES team for these virtual webinars, including this very special one, the 19th one, that I think will go down into history. I also want to add my own word of welcome to all those who have joined from the different parts of the world, and I would encourage you wherever you are to still make known your name and maybe your association with Dr. Charles, and perhaps even where you're joining from in the chat. Continue to do that so that we can really appreciate the breadth and scope and reach of this webinar as it goes, I think, global right across the world. This webinar session will have some very interesting and exciting speakers that I will shortly introduce, and each in turn will reflect on, I think, the intellectual contribution that Dr. Charles would have brought into their lives or into their space over their time with him. And I think each person on this call could also reflect on the different opportunities that they have had to interact with Dr. Charles. And so we will hear in this conversation just some of those inspiring ideas, some of those philosophical concepts that I think Dr. Charles has shared with us. I also want to welcome not just our panelists, but also those who are joining us from the Commonwealth Secretariat. A lot of our staff, we would have been having our team meeting at this time. So all those staff who have agreed to join this webinar in honor of Dr. Charles, we welcome you. I also know that on the call we have persons from across the world who are serving as part of our Commonwealth Year of Youth Advisory Committee. At the time of Dr. Henry-Charles' passing, he was the co-chair of the Commonwealth Year of Youth Advisory Committee, a special committee, an intergenerational committee made up of young people and experts who have been entrusted to provide advice to the Secretariat in this, the Commonwealth Year of Youth. So let me welcome you. And I also want to welcome all those others who are joining, whether you have worked with Dr. Charles in an academic context or in youth development context, maybe in a sociology or social policy context. However you have joined, we welcome you to this session. And let me thank you for taking the time to be a part of this session. Allow me now to just give an overview that we will have the 5 presentations, short presentations on some aspect of the work that Dr. Charles will do. I'll ask you to retain your notes or any questions that you may have to challenge our panelists on some of what they have said. And then after the 5 presentations, we will have an open space for your own contribution and reflections, as well as any questions or comments that you may have on what has been said. Following that, as I think Dr. St. Bernard mentioned, we will have a reflective thought by Dr. Marjorie, who I think many of us are very eager to hear from our own thoughts, and then we will go to the vote of thanks. But again, let me thank you as we kick off for this session. This session is entitled Empowering Peoples and Institutions, Youth Work and Youth Development, and Celebrating the Legacy of Dr. Henry Charles. So without any further ado, allow me to welcome and present to you this morning or good afternoon, this afternoon, wherever you're joining from, Dr. Terri-Ann Gilbert-Roberts. Dr. Terri-Ann Gilbert-Roberts is the research manager at the Commonwealth Secretariat's Youth Program, and she serves in the Secretary General's office alongside some of our colleagues who are on this call. And she works really to make sure that certainly from the youth perspective, the 56 countries are keeping a pace with evidence-based youth policy and with a thought of inclusive development at the heart of what they do. In her wide array of work, she has written on citizens' participation, governance and decision-making, and writes a lot about politics for development, regional integration, and youth empowerment in her books. She is the founding member of the SALISES 50/50 Youth Development Cluster, of which Dr. Henry Charles was a member. And allow me now to welcome Terri-Ann to the floor and ask her to speak with us and to engage with us on this idea of co-creating and youth mainstreaming. What was Henry Charles' challenge to those of us in the Commonwealth? Terri-Ann, over to you.
Thank you so much, Lane, and thank you, colleagues. Good afternoon, good morning to everyone. It's such an honor to be a part of this forum, to be able to reflect on Henry's work. I knew Henry for over 20 years, first as a youth leader who just admired his work from afar and then benefited from his mentorship and advice. But over the last decade, I had the privilege to work very closely with him through the SALISES 50/50 Youth Research Cluster, and while he was conducting his doctoral research on youth policy in Grenada. There's no doubt that the depth and breadth of his academic, policy, and practice contributions are immense. And not least because we're grateful for the way in which, as a member of the cluster, he helped us to advance an indigenous body of Caribbean scholarship on youth policy and development through his writings, but also because of the technical expertise he lent to empowering both institutions and young people in practice in the Caribbean and around the Commonwealth. Now, most of you will know that Henry had a very long association with the Commonwealth. For those who are not familiar, that's a grouping of 56 countries that Lane mentioned, committed to cooperation on peace, democracy, and development. But it's an institution which, as early as 1973, raised to a very high profile the relationship between the state and young people and made that the center of its work by establishing the Commonwealth Youth Program. Henry was a graduate of the CYP. He completed a certificate in youth development work in St. Lucia in the early 1980s, and he was exposed to some ideas from around the Commonwealth and analytical frameworks that actually, along with the writings of Walter Rodney and others, influenced his activism around the formation of the St. Lucia National Youth Council. And following a career in trade unionism, it was some 20 years later that he came full circle, and he was appointed, as Godfrey had mentioned, as regional director of the CYP's Caribbean Center in Guyana. And one of his earliest contributions as director was to deliver a lead paper to Commonwealth youth ministers in the Bahamas, where he spoke about making a paradigm shift in youth development from a deficit approach to a transformational approach. That idea of rejecting conceptualizations of young people as problems to be solved and instead embracing a positive youth development approach remains an embedded ethos of the Commonwealth Youth Program today, for which we are very grateful. In my reflections today, I'll just share some insights that I've gained from conversations I had with Henry, particularly over the last 8 to 9 months, in relation to his most recent service as the co-chair of the Intergenerational Commonwealth Year of Youth Advisory Committee. When in 2022, heads of government mandated this special year of youth-led action, we couldn't think of a better person to advise the Secretariat on the activities than Henry, because he was somebody who fully internalized a perspective which recognized the rights of young people to lead and the assets that they bring to the process of sustainable development. But he assumed his role as co-chair at an interesting moment. On the one hand, the CYP was about to celebrate 50 years of service to Commonwealth member states. But on the other hand, Henry was acutely aware that those celebrations were taking place against the background of an increasingly unequal world, on the back of a global pandemic, a world that's changing rapidly, not least as a result of new transformative technologies and new conflicts. But it was still a world with weak institutions and broken systems of governance, which were ill-equipped to respond to the diverse challenges that people face today, especially the needs of young people who make up the majority of our societies in the Commonwealth. But yet they still today face the injustice of exclusion from decision-making and enjoying socioeconomic prosperity. He understood that the year was a moment in which he could encourage, or if you will, challenge the Commonwealth family of institutions to undertake another paradigm shift as he had done in 2005. And what he was challenging us to do is to deepen the engagement between the state and young people through 2 intersecting strategies. Those are youth mainstreaming and co-creation. Those were core concepts of his co-leadership of the Year of Youth Committee. And in fact, his philosophical orientation around this actually influenced the theme of the Year of Youth, which is co-creating solutions for a peaceful and sustainable future. And that challenge that he gave to us went to everyone in the Commonwealth family, meaning the intergovernmental agencies like the Secretariat and the CYP, the national ones or member governments, and civil society or youth networks and organizations and accredited organizations. He was challenging all of us to adopt youth mainstreaming and co-creation as the leading strategies for our approach to youth empowerment. But why was he doing this? It's because for Henry, he saw youth mainstreaming as a rights-based strategy for social justice and intergenerational equity. This was the route to youth empowerment. It was a process to facilitate a more integrated and coordinated approach to youth development that made sure that the entire state, all the agencies, but the entire nation took up the responsibility to ensure that young people were empowered. And you see his words here about that responsibility. But secondly, he also believed that young people had to play an important and critical role as co-creators in conceptualizing the way in which we even conceive of youth development. In fact, the way that he put it was that he said that with 70% of the population, 60 to 70% of the population being young people, he saw it as unconscionable that people could even think that we shouldn't include young people in the design of policies, programs, and making decisions around investments for youth development. So as you can see here, he didn't ever mince his words. But he felt that if we were very serious about equity, social justice, and empowerment, there were 4 critical measures that we had to adopt if we were going to achieve youth mainstreaming and co-creation seriously. We had to have an enabling environment, adequate and appropriate resourcing, commitment to youth participation, and accountability. Now, I'll just mention before I close 3 areas in which he challenged us because he felt there was an implementation deficit in 3 areas in the Commonwealth. First, in relation to the enabling environment, he challenged us as the Secretariat and as governments about the fact that we had inadequate, haphazard, and ad hoc institutional change to meet the challenge of mainstreaming. Despite commitments from member states through heads and ministers 7 years ago, we still have today countries that don't have a national youth policy and don't have national youth bodies. He began some work in Belize, for example, to help to break down the barriers that prevent mainstreaming by dealing with the cultural issues, the political culture that doesn't encourage an integrated approach to development or the inclusion of young people. That was an area in which he felt we needed more uniformly to support deep capacity building across the Commonwealth. The second issue relates to youth participation. He felt that young people were inadequately involved from the very beginning. It was the hallmark of his work, his research work and his thesis, as you'll hear from my colleague who will speak more about his community conversations in his research on Grenada. But in our conversations, he spoke a lot about the extent to which we're involving all young people. Are we creating a space for even the risk takers, the ones who challenge the status quo, which was something he loved about young people? The young people who are, what, as he would say with a laugh, outside the Marlborough House, where the Secretariat is in London, the most marginalized. Is our participation truly popular to involve everyone? And he left a challenge for us to create in this year a more dynamic opportunity for those inclusive spaces for young people, because he warned that if we don't do that, we may find that young people become so frustrated with us, including the youth networks that are meant to be representative, that they see us as part of the problem rather than as allies in finding the solution. The third and final thing that I spoke with Henry about over the last few months was the issue of evidence. He spoke about this so much, about how critical it was to inform decision-making, to keep governments accountable, but also to help public officers and youth workers and young leaders reflect more carefully on what we're doing, why we're doing it, and whether it's making a difference. But he did warn us about whose knowledge is being treated as powerful. He warned us to be careful of the agendas of experts who may be biased, and the need for us to increasingly engage young people in the collecting of evidence through participatory approaches. So as I conclude, just allow me to insert a little personal note here in summarizing Henry's call to action to the Commonwealth around youth mainstreaming and co-creation. Here we are in this photograph at a meeting with Henry, and you see us laughing here. That's what Henry was like. Though he didn't mince his words and his critique could be very sharp, it was always a healthy critique. It was delivered with the passion of a revolutionary, the depth of an intellectual, and the flair of an advocate. But it was always meant to motivate rather than discourage. One of the most lasting impressions of Henry, for me, was a way in which he could raise the level of the discourse while breaking down barriers to inclusion. In other words, he would push you to self-reflection and critical consciousness, but to serve the greater good of creating spaces for inclusion of the most marginalized. And I think that that is how we should see his call to action. We need to accept his critique in good spirits, but we need to heed his advice. To reintroduce critical consciousness in youth development discourse, these are his words, emphasize social justice in our approach, and continue to challenge the existing paradigm so that we can move towards transformative, responsive, and emancipatory policies, programs, and strategies that are rooted in the realities of young people's lives. I think that if we do that, we will honor his life and his work, and we have a good chance of carrying on his legacy. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Terri-Ann, for that opening presentation on co-creation and youth mainstreaming. And may I just ask you, as you're on now, as we ask the others to also reflect on this, do you think that, for Henry going forward, as you thought about what he would have mentioned as we go forward, what do you think he would have made of the idea that come the end of the year of youth? What should we have seen in the Commonwealth? His challenge to us was to, okay, co-create and mainstream, but at the end of the year, what do you think would have been his vision for the Commonwealth at the end of the year?
Yeah, this issue of social justice and I think Godfrey mentioned it early, Dr. St. Bernard spoke about his championing of youth voice. I think at the end of the year, he wanted to see a vision of a Commonwealth youth development agenda that was grounded in the needs of some young people that perhaps we haven't heard of before. As much as we have been working over the last 50 years to promote youth participation, there are groups and categories of young people that we still never hear from, and their views are not privileged in the agenda going forward. So I think that's what he wanted to see. And he thought that that would shift the actual focus on the program. If we listen to those who are most in need of support, the kind of work we do would also change. I think that's what he was thinking of.
Thank you very much. We'll come back to some of that discussion later as we talk about what is co-creation, what is mainstreaming, and what does that mean. You know, some would argue that mainstreaming is not what we need. You need youth who are not in the mainstream, which is a little bit opposite of what he's saying. So even though you're saying mainstreaming, you're saying he wants to see those not in the main, those who are on the outskirts. So it's an intellectual conversation that we want to pick up, and maybe others will want to weigh in on what is the merits of mainstreaming youth. Do youth want to be in the center? Or are we seeing youth saying, no, we are rejecting what is in the middle. We want to be on the outskirts of the conversation. We want to affect the change from the outside in, not the inside out. But let's see if we could pick up on a little bit on that later. But thank you so much for those very good words. And I know those in the listening on would have really, what your words would have resonated with them, particularly those who served as members of the steering committee, the advisory committee for the Year of Youth. Allow me now to hasten to another way of looking at Dr. Charles, which is through the eyes of Amilcar Sanatan. Now, one of the things you'll know is that Henry inspired lots of young, bright people. And to my mind, Amilcar is one of those bright, beautiful people from the Caribbean that I like to hear and like to have conversations with. And Amilcar is the Assistant Director, Gender Affairs, Gender and Children Affairs of the Office of the Prime Minister, Trinidad and Tobago. And he will be sharing with us on Henry Charles' reasoning on youth political agency and agenda setting. Amilcar could not be with us today, but he has sent a message through. Amilcar is well known to many of us in this space. He studied at the University of the West Indies, studied interdisciplinary gender studies, and is currently a PhD candidate in cultural studies. Amilcar, we want to hear from you, and we'll take his video now. I'm going to ask our colleagues in the SALISES team to help us to hear from Sanatan.
I thank the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies in partnership with the Commonwealth for inviting me to share some reflections on the work of Henry Charles, youth development scholar, practitioner, and leader. The Caribbean and Commonwealth gained a wealth of knowledge and socio-political resources through his thought and political leadership. Dr. Charles would be remembered for his near-evangelical mission against youth deficit approaches in development and his commitment to the poor and those made vulnerable by inequalities. I miss him dearly. He was a political father to me, as he was to dozens of youth throughout the region. Today, I will discuss his concept of Wezonnen on youth political agency and agenda setting. As part of Henry Charles' creative application of scholarship, he extended radical theoretical concepts to the Caribbean context. In his PhD dissertation, he began to explore the everyday social relation of Wezonnen as a form of popular youth engagement. He defined it as a St. Lucian Creole concept that connotates profound reasoning, characterized by sharing perspectives, even the inconveniences of relationships, processes, systems, or phenomena. In personal correspondence, Henry Charles explained that Wezonnen informed his posture and politics of engaging young people, especially those who were critical of the social, political, and economic order of the day. He saw it as a space to mediate conflict among youth where they were located, while understanding the contradictions of the society through the discourses. This praxis has epistemic and methodological Caribbean and Latin American roots in the Brazilian educator Paulo Freire's critical pedagogy and critical consciousness, Guyana's Walter Rodney groundings, and the Rastafari concept of resonance for equitable, just, and grounded approaches to collective understanding and knowledge creation. Wezonnen formed the base of Charles' youth development policy formulation, not consultations. For him, consultations were processes that were hierarchical, overly technocratic, and too easily tempted to fall into the deficit approach to youth work and engagement. While Charles did not live to outline his methodology technically, a young generation of scholars served to benefit by exploring the scholarly and political utility of this approach to theorizing and youth policy development. Through Wezonnen, he firmly believed that youth as individuals independently or collectively can apply critical reasoning abilities to describe their experiences, develop a profound understanding about their concrete reality, and devise, implement, and evaluate solutions to their problems. This approach forces us to reflect on the following questions. How are youth communicating their issues and perspectives on youth policy? What are youth engaging in? Where are youth, engaging in critical dialogue on the society and their reality? What constitutes a youth leader? And what models of youth leadership across diverse spaces in the youth population can we benefit from? I would like to add that a gender analysis would strengthen this framework. Feminist scholarship on agenda setting, consider the gender dimensions of leadership, the mainstreaming of women's and girls' issues on the development agenda, such as combating gender-based violence, gender disparities in the economy, and menstrual health and hygiene. These are not just gender issues, these are development issues. Gender issues are development issues. Further, the politics of youth development and agenda setting must meaningfully incorporate the emotional labor and experiences of leaders. Wezonnen has a methodological approach which requires to be properly designed into the youth development planning process. It must be adequately resourced and given the adequate time and flexibility to facilitate the youth development process. It would give teeth to the Commonwealth asset-based empowerment, rights-based approach in youth mainstreaming. Similarly, the Declaration of Paramaribo on the Future of Youth in the Caribbean Community by 2020, and that was made by the CARICOM heads of government. It affirmed the belief that the unique perspective, creative energy, the other assets which young people possess are essential elements of social innovation and development. The truth of the matter is that the Caribbean youthscape has fallen woefully short of living up to its promises and affirmations in regional and national development. Without reservation, Henry Charles called out the betrayal of youth from the weak, hard and fast consultations with youth, selective biases for the appointment of youth ambassadors to represent youth in the national community, and the lack of support for youth leaders after they were formalized, such as the lack of funding for international travel for key policy meetings, and the consistent exclusions of youth who were made vulnerable in the society and considered out of reach. In short, he saw the Papi show that passed for youth development at all levels among state and non-state actors in government, development spaces, and in the youth movement. In conclusion, Henry Charles Wezonnen was our effort to foreground his deep political conviction that youth are the masters of their destiny. To remix the Haitian author and political activist Jacques Roumain, his dialogue in Gouverneur de la Rosée, L'homme est le boulanger de sa vie, we say les jeunes sont les boulangers de leur vie. The youth are the bakers of their lives. Thank you, good sir, comrade, political father, and believer in the capacity and cause of youth. Plenty love.
Allow me on your behalf to thank Amilcar for his powerful presentation, reflecting on Henry's contribution. Again, very similar to some of what I heard from Dr. Terri-Ann Gilbert Roberts around Henry's contribution being a challenge to what was the current status quo with youth development, and indeed how we need to really reflect on youth development across the Caribbean, but also the world. And this idea that pulling young people right at the center and having that conscious conversation, that reasoning with them, the groundings with them, as we talk about Walter Rodney, would be an important part of bringing them into the heart of the conversation that we hope would have led to the changes we want to see. I wanted to reflect on some of what Amilcar mentioned, particularly around Henry's discussion around the asset-based or positive youth development and why that was so important. But I hope that towards the end, we can have a conversation with each of us about how do we understand this concept of positive youth development and bringing young people into the heart of that conversation and not having them at the outskirts of that. So let me thank you on your behalf again for Amilcar's presentation. Though not with us, certainly has added a wonderful reflection to our thought this afternoon. Then let's go another step further. We're going now to a very close colleague, a former colleague of ourselves, Miss Dwynette Eversley. Dwynette worked very closely with Henry as in the regional center, and indeed after that in working in the region to ensure that the policy framework across the region was as strong as it could be. Miss Eversley has over 25 years of development experience, spanning from a career in maritime administration, law, and policy, and she has been instrumental in working on the Caribbean Center for Development Administration. She has served in the regional center of the Commonwealth Secretariat, as you know, as not just program manager, but at one point in time also acting regional director. She has completed policies across the region of the Caribbean, and I think that is going to be an important part of what Ms. Eversley might share with us, as she will speak to us on the important topic of framing youth empowerment and agency for Caribbean youth development, lessons from Commonwealth youth governance frameworks. We want to welcome Mrs. Eversley to this conversation. She has a wealth of experience, and I want to hear from her own reflection as a colleague and friend of Dr. Charles, and one who has been so instrumental in leading the effort in the Caribbean region and indeed across the world on policy, and also supporting some of the ideas and philosophies that Henry brought. Ms. Eversley, welcome, over to you.
Thank you very much, Lane. It's a pleasure to be here. I thank SALISES and the Commonwealth for being firmly behind this discourse that is taking place this morning. It allowed me in preparing to walk down memory lane with some of the excellent work that we had done as the Commonwealth Youth Program Caribbean Center, and reflect on how Henry's work then continues to shape questions for youth development. Because when he joined us in 2005, I'm living in the future, he started talking very early, as Terri-Ann Gilbert Roberts already indicated. He started talking about a paradigm shift. And I'm trying to get this slide to go, and it's not going anywhere. Okay, so in that paradigm shift, he understood, first of all, that governments must light the way. And this should be taken in the context that youth development was not resident in a youth ministry or not resident under the portfolio of a director of youth. And it was a lot of discussion and cultural changes and reasoning that supported a move towards that. It was very evident in the Commonwealth's own youth mainstreaming strategy. And I look forward to the discussion of what is mainstream and what is not, and how do underserved, what people call underserved youth populations, find themselves part of that. So he joined the CYP in 2005, and in one of his first reflections at the COSOD of CARICOM, reiterated some of the fundamental issues that we should be addressing, that governments should facilitate as part of the enabling environment for youth development. The data collection, the research on youth development, the facility to exchange research findings and best practices, and making the media a strategic partner in youth development. And we can all reflect from then to now what has been the progress of this. Because Henry said, most importantly, governments and the relevant agencies must demonstrate the appropriate consciousness, vision, and political will to adopt and implement more sustainable youth development strategies where necessary. And so while we had that concept that there must be an enabling environment, there must be ecosystem attention to engaging youth and making the concerns of youth factored in at all stages of development in all sectors. Henry also engaged a more dynamic discussion about youth centrality to decision-making. And we had at that stage a lot of discussion about youth-focused development, and it became not youth-focused development, but youth-centered development. And why youth-centered development? And I think Amilcar's presentation touched on it recently. Youth-centered and youth-centered development did not mean getting what Henry sometimes referred to as designer youth only as part of the decision-making conversation. It meant reaching others who were not normally seen at the workshops and the Commonwealth meetings and who were not actually nominated to be CARICOM youth ambassadors. Those young people in the villages they needed to be part of that decision-making. And this picture that you're seeing on your screen is actually that process where young people from a region far, far away called Mabaruma in Guyana, one of the hinterland areas, were part of a discussion on what they wanted to see for their own development. They wanted to discuss who were youth, how should investments be made in youth? Because Henry said, if you look at our people, we would fool ourselves in believing that young people don't want to see a better form of governance. And so putting youth at the center was a way of forcing discussion on what is this better form of governance that we all want, that young people wanted. Sorry about that. And that also seeped into a more fundamental, intellectual, philosophical, but also a more centered approach into making youth agency sustainable. Again, Amilcar mentioned it in his presentation. And what you're seeing on the screen is that thrust for youth agency. The Commonwealth always supported youth at the center of decision-making, youth agency, but young people themselves recognized something was lacking. And those discussions took place over 5 years in the Caribbean about what was lacking in youth governance and what kind of supports should be focused on making youth decision-making and development central to all Caribbean development. And CYP supported what is now called the Caribbean Youth Council. And there could be a lot of discussions about what is happening with the youth governance structures across the world, whether they are representative still or not. But at that forum, there was a recognition by young people, and it says here, there seems to be a common misconception about the range, role, and advantages to young people of a youth governance group. It's more than just another youth-led focused NGO. Many of the youth governance platforms are not visible and not recognized and not supported by the youth population, and in some instances by the governments. And so that level of reflection, positioning new directions for the youth governance in the region was what Henry facilitated. He enabled by that, being able to talk with him. And it was all about social justice. It was all about social, economic, and political participation, because we were also facing in the Caribbean a proliferation of discussions and attention to multi-billion-dollar investments on punitive responses to crime and violence. And so youth governance and the natural nexus with decision-making and reaching young people wherever they were and are, to extend that social justice discussion prompted Henry and Eversley in 2008 to pen this discussion about managing political alienation and economic and social exclusion, economic marginalization and social exclusion, because without that, we will not going to have these wonderful Caribbean paradise narratives were going to be espoir malpapai. And Marjorie will be able to explain better than I what that means. But he told us very early it was like putting your hope in a male pawpaw tree, because a male pawpaw tree could never bear. And again, the discussion about a paradigm shift, and this was a discussion and a call in all our work to underpin, to interweave, to intersect the rights of youth and the concept of restorative justice, rehabilitation, and re-entry into society. And so these reflections frame the work of Henry, similar to the work of Jean Prismard in 1928, who authored a seminal piece called Ainsi par la langue. And I thought that I was given context to all that he has done, and some which other speakers before me have highlighted about the doctrines, the principles, the reflections, and the space he allowed us to inhabit. And when he said there's a dialogue taking place and a search for new directions, and he asked, what are some of the initiatives that we should undertake as we continue to witness the evolution of our own Caribbean? He said that in 2008. And here we are in 2023, reflecting on his work and legacy, and we are still having those discussions. What is the space that we inhabited then, and how do we need to move beyond into new galaxies, the unexplored, the undiscovered territory? And Henry, everybody talks about Henry as an intellectual, and he was an academic, he was a pragmatist, he was a lover of life. And when he came to the Caribbean in a very regional sense, in a very real way, he transferred ownership and governance of decision-making into structures within our agency for young people, youth interns, to have a say. And this final slide reflects that, the willingness to discuss, the willingness to listen. And it ends with one of his favorite quotations from the Guyanese poet, Martin Carter. This I have learned today. This I have learned today, expect tomorrow hero or monster. All of us are involved. All of us are consumed. So the dialogue continues. The answers we have about youth development, youth landscapes, youth spaces, youth in the ecosystem development may not be best fit. But Henry's work encourages us to reframe and revisit the learning questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dwynette, for those very, very powerful words of reflection. And I want to ask you, what was it like to work with Henry in terms of the inspiration he would have brought to you and the team at the time in the center? How infectious was that kind of vision and inspiration? Probably you could share with us a little bit, as you spoke about social justice, him wanting to change paradigms, but what about the vision and how he portrayed that with the team? How was it to work on a day-to-day basis?
Henry was, as we all of us know, he was a real person. And a real person, you measure realness because you would have dealt with people who did not seem to be as real. And that realness meant creating spaces for everybody and recognizing youth work was not distinct from young people's place in the trade union movement, for example, young people's space in talent and in the media and in all spheres. It was working with Henry allowed us to position and see young people everywhere. And I think because he saw young people everywhere and he created new directions for us to work that way, he also allowed us to create wonderfully spread out networks all over, so that young people and youth development can be now where it may not have been so foundationally so, really mainstreamed, and I don't want to use that word too much, but that kind of all-embracing work. Yeah, it was fun.
It was fun. I think that sums it up as well. That sounds like fun to me. So I think thank you so much, Dwynette, for the third of our 5 presentations. And you brought another angle or part of Henry's life in the center and how that evolved. And you've shared a little bit about that. And we want to revisit that in some of the questions that I see coming through about how that shaped the rest of his conversations with the rest of the world, starting in that Caribbean center. If you're just joining us this afternoon, this morning, from wherever you are in the world, and we want to thank you for taking the time to be a part of this conversation, this 19th SALISES virtual forum jointly between the SALISES team and the Commonwealth Secretariat. And the theme we're focusing on is empowering peoples and institutions, youth work, youth development, and celebrating the legacy of Dr. Henry Charles. We have had 3 of our 5 presentations so far, and if you missed it, I would ask you to take the time to revisit the earlier presentations, maybe on the recording, because you've missed something really special and something wonderful. We're going to take the next 2 presentations, and then we'll take some questions and your own reflections and thoughts, so keep writing them down and keep a note of them, because we want to unpack some of these very intellectual conversations that we have heard, some of these ideas and philosophies that we have discussed already. Well, we're going to move on now to our 4th speaker and presenter and panelist, Mrs. Suzette Moses-Burton. Now, much has been said about Henry's work within the context of the Commonwealth, but Henry didn't belong to the Commonwealth. He belonged to the world, and so his contribution was far greater than some would want to believe. It extended beyond the Commonwealth as well. And I want to believe now that in this next presentation, we're going to hear a bit more about Henry's work in leading the charge to put young people at the center of the post-disaster response in Sint Maarten. And we have as our speaker and presenter for this session, Ms. Suzette Moses-Burton. Her LinkedIn note says that she is a dynamic visionary leader and an achievement-driven or results-oriented manager with over 30 years of experience in nonprofits, private and government sectors. Her current position as team leader, child rights advocate within UNICEF in the Netherlands is interesting for us to reflect on Henry's work. And we want to hear now from Mrs. Suzette Burton on her own perspectives on what Henry would have brought to her work, to her environment, to her space. Over to you, Suzette. Thank you for joining us.
Yes, good morning. Thank you very much, Chair. Good morning, Dr. Sint Maarten, Mrs. Marjorie, Jameson Charles, support staff at UE SALISES and the Commonwealth, my fellow panelists, and Henry's UNICEF, NL, and Sint Maarten government colleagues, and to everybody viewing this webinar. As was stated, my presentation is titled Dr. Henry Charles, Leading the Charge to Put Young People at the Center of the Post-Disaster Response on Sint Maarten. Officially, Henry was our child resilience specialist, an apt title for all who knew him. But beyond the title, and more importantly to us, his Sint Maarten family, he was our friend, our mentor, our champion. Working with Henry afforded all of us the opportunity to more deeply understand not just the definition of meaningful youth participation, but how to take these words from paper to practice through our actions, and to more closely examine the how as well as the why about engagement of young people. At every turn, as we discussed youth engagement across all our project activities, he gently prodded and encouraged us to step out, way out of the box, to go beyond our comfort zone, to relinquish the bits and pieces of control that we have traditionally held while conceptualizing programs for young people, to ensure that we put them at the very center. We came to understand meaningful youth participation from his holistic perspective, which I would now like to share with you in Henry's own words.
Many people ask, what is youth participation?
Sorry, I understand the video isn't showing. Can I get some confirmation, please?
No, it's not showing just yet. We heard the volume of the voice, but we didn't see images.
Okay, let me just stop sharing and start again. Sorry about that. Apologies.
Many people ask, what is youth participation? And it is an important question because there is so much confusion sometimes around this whole issue of youth participation. It is something that you need to do once you have conceptualized what it is you are going to do, then you bring young people in to share with them the ideas. However, if we are to go by what we are mandated to do under the Convention on the Rights of the Child, youth participation, and to underline active youth participation, is about involving children and young people from the very conceptualization of interventions, projects, policies, and programs, and to allow the participation, facilitate the participation throughout the project cycle, including allowing them the voice to give feedback, and also it includes being accountable to them. Once they have participated, to be in a position to share with them, to be accountable. What has happened since you participated? Have we achieved the outcomes? Have we achieved the results that we are looking for? So that is important. The other important thing is that, is it a burden? Is it that youth participation will make your job more difficult? No. As a matter of fact, there are several benefits. One is to make the intervention or the project even more relevant, because if young people are going to be the beneficiaries, then who better than themselves to tell you what are the priorities? So that is extremely important. For our own role here, UNICEF the Netherlands, in terms of our project in Sint Maarten, there are several tangible examples of facilitating youth participation. So for example, we have a positive parenting program that we are developing, and young people were one of the primary stakeholders and the research and formative assessment stage of the program, to get from them what are their concerns, what would they like to see, what for them are the issues surrounding parenting, what kind of standards they would like to see. As well, we are also doing a violence prevention program, and contrary to several opinions that exist sometimes globally, young people are themselves very concerned about the culture of violence that's prevailing in several societies. So what we have done in this instance in Sint Maarten is again to engage young people at the very beginning in this formative assessment. They have been primary stakeholders in terms of telling us what are their concerns, what are their perceptions, and what types of interventions they believe are necessary to address this culture of violence, and what kind of role that they are expecting to play, they are prepared to play as strategic partners in terms of the sustainable development of the country.
This video was recorded as one in a series of videos which were developed for our meaningful youth participation training, which Henry was set to conduct this year with our adolescent development and participation specialist, Mr. Len Wilson, who is also one of Henry's countless mentees and co-creator of this presentation today. Often the word visionary is carelessly bandied about, but to say that Dr. Henry Charles was a visionary would be an understatement. It is impossible to overstate how impactful his personal vision for youth development and youth participation has been on the landscape of the youth sector in Sint Maarten. It is widely known that Sint Maarten was devastated in September 2017 by the record-breaking force of Hurricane Irma. After the successful implementation of an early recovery project in 2018 and 2019, UNICEF the Netherlands was requested to provide additional technical support to the government of Sint Maarten for its longer-term recovery and sustainability, and the Child Resilience and Protection Project was developed. It took no stretch of the imagination to realize that the success of the planned interventions for this project would be reliant on securing the visionary services of Dr. Henry Charles to lead the charge to put young people at the center of the post-disaster response on Sint Maarten. Henry was charged with the task of planning, designing, and executing a violence prevention program, positive parenting support program, early childhood development sector support, and the realization of a national youth monitor. Beyond these designated assignments, Henry provided guidance and mentorship to the team, especially our younger colleagues. True to his nature, Henry was able to motivate and inspire without ever imposing. The entire team looked to him for wisdom and his diplomatic savvy. He set the bar very high for the quality of our work with young people on Sint Maarten. But more importantly than that, he very quietly and unassumingly acted as the glue that kept us all centered and focused on the objectives of ensuring that everything that we did put young people at the center. Henry's knowledge and understanding of the Convention of the Rights of the Child was unparalleled, and he effortlessly wove that knowledge into the discourse about youth development on Sint Maarten. He unceasingly championed the concept that participation rights are the gateway to other categories of rights, such as survival and development and child protection rights. He embedded this belief in all of his assignments and never discounted or minimized the role of young people in influencing the direction of his work. Henry took the lead in authoring the Youth Participation Initiative for the project. In this phased approach to ensure and increase meaningful youth participation in the recovery process and for a sustainable future in the country's development, Dr. Charles insisted on ensuring that decision makers were equipped to adopt and maintain the value of meaningful youth participation. He strongly advocated for the implementation of capacity building interventions targeting key duty bearers and stakeholders, including members of the policy platform, to enhance their capacity to promote and facilitate active youth participation across all development sectors, including child protection, school safety, positive parenting, peace building and violence prevention, climate change mitigation, and disaster risk reduction. He constantly emphasized young people's role as co-creators for sustainable development and insisted that to participate effectively, young people must be given the proper tools, such as information, education, and access to their civil rights. Further, to work with them as leaders, partners, and beneficiaries, and to listen to what matters most to them, to take their views, concerns, and suggestions into account in our policies, strategies, and programs. As a result of his advocacy for meaningful youth participation, we have now established a youth sounding board for child protection in Sint Maarten. This body of young people will influence the development of laws and policies for child protection, lending to a more relevant and informed legal framework, protecting children and young people. Through this and other mechanisms for meaningful youth participation, young people are empowered to play a vital role in their development and communities, helping them learn vital life skills, develop knowledge of human rights and citizenship, and promote positive civic action. Henry was also quite influential in the establishment of the Government of St. Maarten's Integrated Youth Policy. The strategic objectives of the policy are formulated to give direction to policies, legislation, and services that need to be in place to ensure the best outcomes for our young people. In closing, the works of Dr. Henry Wallace Charles are the branches that grace this mighty tree that is his legacy of youth development. The true measure of his impact on St. Maarten lies in his vision and heart for our young people. Many will eat the fruit from his branches, sit under his shade for respite, climb his limbs to gain better perspective of the landscape, but only some will understand the depth and the strength of its roots, the heart and mind to consistently dignify the humanity of children and young people that made it all possible. Those of us who have locked arms with him will do our best to ensure that the roots continue to be generously and frequently watered so that its fruit will ripen and be consumed for generations to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that additional perspective, Mrs. Suzette Moses-Burton. You have brought another dimension, this concept of working with and through the Convention on the Rights of the Child, not just at a youth perspective, but even going into the 0 to 18 age cohort. I wanted to ask you a question just in terms of, you mentioned the response from the staff and the people working around Dr. Charles. But what could you say about his reaction among the young people? When he brought these ideas about the Youth Sounding Board and the others, how did the young people respond? Could you share some of the ideas with us from the case study of St. Maarten?
I think in St. Maarten, first and foremost, a number of the young people were surprised to have been asked to engage in the formative part of the work. When we started the exercise for the Youth Sounding Board, we actually had a series of consultations with various young people, and we tried really hard to get some of those young people that, as has been mentioned before, on the margins, on the outskirts. So, we didn't take from the golden youth or the usual suspects. We tried to get all the perspectives. And I think the first thing is that they were very surprised that they were asked to contribute to what this Youth Sounding Board should look like. And then I think for them, they have subsequently expressed that not only were they asked and their views collected and sort of worked on, but then they were called back to form a working group to actually develop the terms of reference for the Youth Sounding Board. And while they were given something that was sort of like a shell, what are the things that have to be included in a terms of reference, they were given complete freedom to develop these things themselves. And they have subsequently gone through the entire process, and now we're at the recruitment stage for young people being involved, and all of them who've been involved have expressed their appreciation for the fact that the final Youth Sounding Board are actually co-creators. So we went a step higher than what is generally outlined in the ladder of participation, in that they are actually co-creating and co-created what that body looks like, and weren't just given things to say, what do you think about X, Y, and Z?
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, Suzette. I think you have added another dimension to our conversation in looking at this idea of meaningful youth participation with the case study of real life experience of what Henry would have done in St. Maarten, transforming what could have been a very challenging circumstance for young people in bringing out all that positive messaging and empowerment for the young people in St. Maarten. We want to probably hold that concept of meaningful participation so wonderfully shared by Henry himself. And I hope that others would want to add to, maybe ask of you, just how the sounding board is working still, and what are some of the other initiatives that would have originated because of that initial work that Henry had done. But from us, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. this wonderful live presentation from Henry. It was beautiful to see him and hear from him again. Thank you so much for adding that to the webinar today. Ladies and gentlemen, we now go on to the final part of this 5-part picture. It is almost impossible to frame Henry's contribution in these 5 presentations, but I'm hoping you're beginning to see a glimpse of the kind of person he was, his concepts, his ideas, his philosophy. And I think SALISES will need to have a part 2 and a part 3, maybe a part 4 on different parts of his life that we have not touched on in this presentation, in this series of presentations. Allow me now to welcome another very good colleague and friend, another dimension, Mrs. Kemberley Gittens. Kimberly is the operations officer, social analyst at the Caribbean Development Bank, and would have been very close to Henry over the last few years, particularly as they work together on the CDB's first youth policy and operational strategy. I am very happy that Kimberly is on the call because I know she has a lot of experience and is very passionate. She has a lot of experience working across social development issues, as she has worked in UNFPA, IAEA, UN Women, but now her work at the bank and her interaction with Henry will give her some platform now to share with us just some of what she has learned from Henry and his contribution. Kimberly, welcome. Good to see you. Over to you.
Thank you, Lane. I think I'm having a little bit of a technological challenge.
No, it looks perfect. You're good to go.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction. And it really is, I think, a pleasure to be a part of this discussion today. As you would have seen from the program, today I'm sharing reflections on Henry's contribution to positive youth development, to the policy and practice within the Caribbean Development Bank. Dr. Charles's leadership in CDB's process to develop and operationalize the bank's first youth policy and operational strategy is considered amongst CDB staff as nothing short of a tour de force. Allow me to share a little bit of the context, and then I will discuss his contribution in terms of shaping what we call our YPOS and the practice, especially regarding positive youth development. Many of you are aware of CDB's work. It's a multilateral development bank. And some of you will be aware that the bank started its operations in 1970. So it's been well over 50 years now. And the bank's mission, as documented at that time, was to contribute to the harmonious economic growth and development of member countries in the Caribbean, promoting economic cooperation and integration among them. In its 50 years of operation, prior to the development of the youth policy, prior to the crafting and the approval of the youth policy, youth development was, of course, a core part of the bank's work. And this is clear given the nexus between youth development and poverty reduction, and also addressing issues of inequality. And it also aligned with the commitment of the bank's borrowing member countries to the imperative of youth development. I mean, we've heard from Terri-Ann reflecting on her work with Henry and the identification of a number of gaps that need to be addressed. So there are policies, some of them dated, some in need of being developed, but countries have signaled some level of commitment in the main to youth development in a number of policy frameworks, and also having signed on to a number of global policy and planning frameworks, including the Sustainable Development Goals. And of course, we have the CARICOM Strategic Plan and the CARICOM Youth Development Action Plan. So in terms of CDB's work in the area of youth development, this would have included our support in education and training, including the bank's work on technical and vocational education and training, our investments in creative industries and innovation, decent work and livelihoods, and inclusion of community-level models for entrepreneurship, as well as our work in citizen security and youth engagement. However, when we undertook an assessment of the impact of the work and the nature of the contribution of our investments, we recognized that there was a greater scope for synergies and concomitantly for the promotion of optimal outcomes, and that this required improved planning and more strategic and focused operational direction in terms of our youth development. And again, aligned with the pursuit of social justice in the region that has emerged in all of the presentations thus far. And so the bank began in 2018 the process of undertaking a study on the youth development context in our board member countries, followed by the bank's the development of our youth policy and strategy. I want to signal that we had sought recommendations from a range of partners and from CDB staff as we looked for consultants to lead this process. And of course, Henry's name was at the fore. And when we reached out to him, we asked him to consider submitting an expression of interest to lead this work. Henry instead opted for a position on the bank's reference group. For those of you who are familiar with the process that we followed to develop the youth policy will know that that reference group was comprised of representatives across a number of development agencies, as well as individuals in their own right with a track record of exceptional work in youth development. So there was no remuneration. Henry opted to volunteer to support the development of CDB's youth policy and strategy rather than to undertake the consultancy. And I think this is just one example of the measure of the man, Henry Wallace Charles. But it should come as no surprise to anyone when I say that Henry distinguished himself on the reference group, sharing, interrogating, challenging, guiding, and connecting. A year into that process, CDB determined that there was a need to revisit the approach. And we, in addition to the reference group, we had a working group established, and that working group comprised representatives across from the various departments and divisions and units across CDB. And the team unanimously agreed that we should again approach Henry to lead this process, to complete the study, and to deliver the policy and strategy. And I want to say that I've heard earlier persons speak about the fact that for Henry, it wasn't just at a philosophical level. It wasn't just in discourse, but his very actions demonstrated his commitment to youth development. Henry could have chosen anyone. There were many persons eager to be a part of the process. Henry came on board to lead the completion of the work to get us to that youth policy and strategy with young women, Tioka Dove and Tiffany Daniels Bailey, no stranger to the youth development space, young women. And for me, that was a testament to the fact that Henry's actions consistently aligned with his philosophy and the discourse in which he engaged in terms of young people being at the center and young people leading on issues that are central to their growth and development. So the team first delivered the bank's the report called Co-Creating Sustainable Futures, again, the language of co-creation with young people. And that study on youth development across the bank's 19 board member countries identified a number of priority areas that would in turn become the strategic pillars of the bank's youth policy and operational strategy. I just want to share with you those pillars. And so even in terms of the language, and this will come out, I think, a bit more clearly as I continue my sharing with you, the focus was on where do we want to go and not a fixation on deficits, yes? So the study prioritized, and this is based on discussions with young people across the 19 BMCs. Again, young people, not just those who were already at the center, but those who were considered to be marginalized, persons whose voices you typically would not have heard. That was a key part of the methodology in developing the youth policy and operational strategy. The priorities / pillars that were identified by young people and others who work in the area of youth work and youth development were enhancing young people's participation in and contributions to sustainable economic growth in the region, harnessing youth social and intellectual capital, contributing to the creation of healthy, safe, nurturing, and peaceful communities and spaces for young people. supporting youth awareness and action on climate change, disaster mitigation, environmental sustainability, and food security, supporting active citizenship and youth participation in democratic and community life, and critically, enhancing the capacity within the BMCs and within CDB for youth responsive development, mainstreaming and targeted responses in pursuit of youth development. We, I think, heard in the discussions today as well that focus on positive youth development, the focus on youth mainstreaming, and the intersectionality analysis that were hallmarks of the work in which Henry engaged. And it's no different for the work that he led on for CDB. And with regards to the need for that positive youth development approach to underpin the policy and inform action, I want to share an extract from the study that was undertaken. And it reads, "There are concerns, however, that our development and public policy processes are not sufficiently responsive to youth ideas of solutions to address the challenging issues of today's Caribbean. Indeed, young people continuously express disappointment and frustration at what they view as lukewarm responses to their views and contributions." And critically shared on the screen, deficit characteristics of youth are prevalent in the mass media, development and public policy discourse and spaces across the board member countries of the Caribbean Development Bank, where youth involvement in crime and violence is constantly highlighted as the defining portrait of Caribbean youth. Yet many young people in the BMCs aspire to become economically empowered, socially connected, active citizens, able to take leadership in their own well-being in an environment where opportunities and outcomes are equal. So again, that understanding of the need to shift, that paradigm shift from a deficit perspective to strength-based approaches to youth development. Henry and his team spared no effort in the process to champion a move away from youth development interventions grounded in deficit-based approaches to youth development, noting that these approaches attributed failures to a lack of effort by or deficiencies in young people, rather than to the failures or limitations of duty bearers, institutions, and systems. Henry believed, and I think he often stated in multiple fora, that a multilateral development bank scaling up efforts in youth development was critical for regional development, and that a positive youth development approach adopted by the bank would have a positive ripple effect across member countries, the potential impact of which he stated could not be overstated. I just want to share quickly on how the work that was led by Henry would have led to a shift in the way the bank would have programmed. As I signaled before, prior to the development of the youth policy and operational strategy, the bank had invested in youth development, but it had not done so in a coherent way and in a way where there was conceptual clarity and there was some inconsistent application of key approaches that we wanted to see in which we needed to see that work embedded. Henry advocated for a positive youth development philosophy and approach guiding the bank's work that would focus on discernible strengths of young people and on building skills, assets, and competencies that would foster healthy relationships and ensure an enabling environment that could transform systems. And more generally, there's a body of research from which he and the team drew that looked at the importance of protective factors or positive influences in programming, and with the recognition that such approaches would help young people succeed and perhaps keep them from behavioral and other problems that could stymie progress, and that indeed would aid better outcomes across their life cycle, as well as greater likelihood of a successful transition to adulthood. And you'll see on the screen that I've shared that shift in terms of having conceptual clarity, the youth responsive programming, looking at targeted and mainstreamed approaches, positive youth development consistently applied and a life cycle approach, working with children and youth from 10 years old up to 35 years old. I want to share very quickly that while there was a strong focus on positive youth development, there was a recognition of a need to integrate the positive youth development approach with other proven strategies and approaches to advance youth development. And so if one takes a look at the youth policy and operational strategy, you would note that there was also a very strong emphasis on the social ecological model, and that affords a framework for understanding the intersecting levels of social system, looking at the individual, interpersonal, community, organizational, and policy enabling environmental factors. The life cycle approach that I have mentioned, which is associated with Erik Erikson's theory of psychosocial development, and importantly as well, Kimberly Crenshaw's work on intersectionality, which looks at how systems of oppression and privilege overlap to create distinct experiences for persons with multiple and intersecting identity categories. And I think I heard this again in Terri-Ann's intervention, and also in Dwynette's, looking outside of the young people who are already at the center and understanding why there is that marginalization and exclusion of persons based on social categorizations and identities, and unpacking then how one would address the marginalization and exclusion of key groups who, if they desire to be in the development process, should be given those opportunities. In conclusion, I want to signal that in practice, by example, and in the way in which Henry wrote and advocated, he demonstrated with such an ease that commitment to empirical grounding of the work, to evidence-based decision-making, that commitment to analysis of an advocacy for change and action, and also intergenerational dialogue that could unpack what was happening in terms of governance, that would examine and interrogate and call out unequal power structures that serve to marginalize and exclude young people. And always in his approaches, he ensured that young people were engaged in a manner that recognized them as requiring a space for the promotion and protection of rights, and also being at the center of development and as equal and trusted development partners. And I think that's important to note, that at every point, in every point along the process, Henry engaged with young people as equal and trusted development partners. In discussions with colleagues across the bank, I think it was signaled again what I said earlier in terms of Henry being a tour de force. He's credited with the fact that the bank was able to mobilize, engage, and reach agreements across multiple diverse stakeholders, including rights holders, on such critical matters. In further discussions, colleagues noted that Henry will long be remembered as a pioneer who championed and advanced the seminal work on youth development within CDB. And another reflected that in addition to his clear intellectual prowess, his experience and expertise, that it was Henry's spirit and the spirit he brought to the work he did that would remain at the fore of their mind. His ability to galvanize people around a common cause and to ensure that those persons who are typically left out of the dialogue, those persons that are usually overlooked in engagement, were brought to the fore, to the center, and treated with dignity and respect. The last conversations I had with Henry focused on the need to pause, take stock, and take fresh guard. We had agreed that after he participated in the bank's most recent youth forum in St. Lucia in June, that we would put our heads together, that we would continue to work with colleagues at the CARICOM Secretariat, with some of the young people from the CYC, some of the young people from CRIC, to determine how we go forward. We were deep in the process of looking at a project which is being conceptualized and led by young people. Henry was also very instrumental in helping us shape the bank's Future Leaders Network, a team of bright and engage young people with whom the bank has a system in place for ongoing engagement and collaboration with a close feedback loop to ensure that we hear their voices and they hear ours, a clear bidirectional flow of information and consultation. I think in reflecting on the process, one thing that comes to mind is that Henry was the right person at the right moment to get us to this point. The previous speaker, Suzette, signaled that his roots spread deep and wide. And it is my hope that the work to which we commit, the work that we will continue to engage in, will allow us to see not just that he was for the right time and that he was the right person to get us to this point, but that with regards to the work of the bank, that we are able to achieve those right outcomes that Henry would have envisioned, and to which, in terms, the planning that he would have invested significant time and thought. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, Kimberly, for those reflections and the wonderful presentation as well. And I want to just ask you now as well, why do you think, you mentioned Henry when he was asked to lead this work in the bank, he brought these two young ladies with him. Why do you think he did that? And then could you share with us what the reaction was from your colleagues and stakeholders when he did that?
Why do I think he did that? That's the measure of the man. I think that's the authenticity. It wasn't just the words. It wasn't just the philosophical perspective. It wasn't just the theory. It was that Henry lived what he preached. He practiced what he preached. And when we talk about putting youth at the center and recognizing the assets that youth possess and their strengths, and allowing others to see that, I think it was second nature. I think it was just who he was. These are bright, gifted young women with a track record of excellent work. Who better to work along with Henry? And I think having that, as a core part of his approach was instrumental, I think, in opening doors. And I want to say that we have continued to work very closely with the young people that we met as a part of that process. And in terms of the reaction in the bank, Henry had distinguished himself in his work, across the region and globally. No one questioned Henry. It was recognized that he was the grandfather of youth development. He had served, he had distinguished himself and led on the YPOS reference group. And as I said, the entire working group in CDB had said unanimously, we need to have Henry take the charge. And so there were no questions. And I think that is important because there was just that level of trust in what he brought to the table. And it opened doors then for young people to come through. And it has continued since then to open additional doors for young people in the work of the bank.
Well, thank you so much for the wonderful presentation and your own personal reflections as well. And for that other dimension of this economic empowerment within the context of the CDB and why it was important for Henry to lead that. Thank you so much. Well, Kimberly, you've rounded out this very short webinar, the last of the 5 presentations that we will have. And all those who are on the call, you've stayed with us. We want to thank you. If you've joined a bit late, this webinar is the 19th for SALISES, and this is a special one looking at the work and contribution of Dr. Henry Charles. And we're going to open up the space now for some discussion on some of what we heard. We've heard from 5 very excellent speakers and presenters, and I want to take note that they've all brought something very interesting and different in their presentations. Our first speaker, Dr. Terri-Ann, spoke about co-creation and youth mainstreaming. Amilcar, who joined us via a video link, spoke about Henry's idea of reasoning, the grounding, and why that was important to raise consciousness. Ms. Dwynette Eversley spoke about this idea of social justice and how Henry, in his work, wanted to make sure that we weren't creating, just empty shells, but actually it was very meaningful in developing those frameworks. And then we heard from practical examples from Suzette Moses-Burton on Henry's work in Sint Maarten, how he brought youth right at the center and demonstrated that and showcased that and really empowered those young people right at the center of a post-disaster response. And you heard finally from our last presenter, Ms. Kemberley Gittens, on how Henry shaped the bank's YPOS, which was really a very powerful thing for him to do, and he was the right person at the right time for. So we're going to open up the space now for a few questions. You could, of course, put them in the chat, but I want to see if it's possible to bring a few of our panelists back on screen for us to have a conversation based on some of what you've heard. And I noticed that there's at least there's a few questions or comments in the chat. I want to kick off with the first one from Gemma. Now, Gemma, many of you probably wouldn't know, but Gemma, I hope she's still on. Gemma, are you still there? Is joining us all the way from, well, is originally from Australia. So it's a great feat if she's actually joining us at this time from there. I hope you're still on, Gemma. But Gemma is asking a very important question here. And her question is focused on, Gemma, I don't know if you want to take the mic and to share, or you want me to share for you. Yeah, but her question is focused on looking down the road. So we've looked at Henry reflectively and some of his work, but now she's brought the idea that technology is now with us, and this digital divide is now a critical part of the world in which our young people and our children must exist. And so her question is, she would like to, on the panelists to probably help us unpack that in a world where we still have youth, gender, and educational and social economic gaps, how do we stop the digital divide from becoming even wider? And she mentions here that many are on the digital highway, but there are many who are not there. And this access for many is going to become a critical issue. And she doesn't have the answer for this, but she'd like to know, what you think Henry would have wanted to see from these young people. So in keeping with some of what I heard, let me probably turn over to a few of our panelists. So kick off with Terri-Ann. You heard Gemma's question. We've looked.
Thanks, Lane, and I'm still up. It's only 1:45 in the morning, so we're good.
Oh,
but
wonderful.
Thank you.
You want to elaborate? You want to elaborate on your question, Gemma?
No, I think that Henry was so good at bringing up the important issues, and I think that he always got to the heart of what's going on so well. And at the moment, with the issues that come and move, and all of the wicked problems that are out there, which the Commonwealth and the Development Bank and everyone else deal with, I think that the digital divide and the remoteness of some people being left further and further behind in that is such a complex statement. And I think that, his yearning for equity in voice and equity in representation would be one of, how do we make sure that those people aren't forgotten in the work that we do?
So I'm going to just turn to our panelists for a response. And we're not trying to answer everything. So I'm just going to give you your own reflection based on how Henry would have seen it. Dr. Terri-Ann Gilbert-Roberts, what do you think about this question?
Yeah, it's an important one. Thanks so much, Gemma, and thanks, Lane. I reflect on this in the context of some work we did with Henry. One of the quotes that I showed in my presentation came from an interview we did with him for a course we developed online for stakeholders to learn about youth mainstreaming and what it is, and youth participation and evidence and safeguarding and all of these things. And we had exactly this discussion when we were in this design group with young people from all over the Commonwealth, youth workers, government officials. And we all wondered, are we doing the right thing? We're putting the information online because at the time we were in the pandemic, we wanted to reach people at a time when we couldn't travel. And I remember Henry, I think, embracing the potential of the digitized world and the tools that become available to us and will become available to us. But he never lost that common touch. In the photographs that were shown by Suzette and Kemberley and Dwynette and so on, you saw some of those engagements, dialogues, workshops, activities with people in some of the most remote areas. I remember that photo that Dwynette showed of the workshop with young people in Guyana, in a remote area. He never wanted us to allow the digital age or the digital tools to use us, but for us to use the tools, which means that we have to have a fit for purpose response. And we need to learn to better understand the populations that we work with. Do we fully understand what it is like? Somebody like me coming from the Caribbean and working in London, what it is like for people in the remotest parts of the Pacific. when it comes to engaging online and not being able to connect. So that my proposal to have an online course is useful to some, but not to everyone. And I think it's about how we analyze in a holistic way and better learn to understand the young people and the people that we serve, so that we can develop fit for purpose, sort of design thinking kind of approaches. I don't have the solution on how to stop the digital divide, but that's just something that Henry was always conscious of.
So is it I think you've really got a good answer of trying to say, no, it's using whatever tools that come, but not forgetting the core. And I wonder if others reflect on that. Suzette, over to you. Your own reflections on this question.
Thanks, Lynn. I think for us, you know, the way that we tried to approach that and the advice that we got from Henry was basically to go to the community, you know, so in not just the youth sounding board exercise, but in the development, in formative assessment phases for the development of both the violence prevention program and the positive parenting support program. You know, Henry ensured that we went to the communities, to the young people where they were, whether it was, you know, we would send a consultant literally to the block, you know, go on the block when we're doing the situation analysis to get a real sense of what young people, those that don't come to the fora, those that may or may not have, you know, the newest smartphone, etc., to go into the schools, you know, gain all of the consent forms and so that we need to, as UNICEF, obviously, you know, from parents to be able to engage and discuss children, set up community town hall type sessions with parents in the evening, get them to bring their kids with them. You know, I see Colleen, who is one of the partners that work most closely with Henry to develop the positive parenting support program. She's in the room with us, and she has a very good sense of how, you know, they set up the various focus group meetings and really community discussions with young people, certainly in the area of the PPSP, but in all of the other areas. You know, that's what Henry encouraged us to do, to get up out of the office, move away from, and, you know, even if it was 1 or 2 young people on the block, you know, on the street, walking down the road, we literally, when we were doing the consultations for the youth sounding board, we invited a certain group of young people that we had in our network. But then when we got to the venue, we literally just stood outside. Were there any young people who would be interested in having this conversation? You know, please come in, kind of thing. So that's, you know, that was our solution in the context of Sint Maarten.
That's good. So it is that you still don't forget the basics. You still continue using those basic tools and approaches, because not everybody will be on the technology, or the digital divide still affects many. I wondered, Ms. Eversley, you have a thought on this particular question. It is a future-facing question. So I wondered, you're taking your knowledge and experience with Henry and applying it to something that Gemma is putting for us now. Any thoughts?
Thank you, Lane. There are 2 angles. Again, when we talk about technology and the digital divide, it's about the access and the opportunity for using technology, for understanding technology. But it's also acceptance that young people will innovate and technology. We had a lot of discussion in a long time ago about traditional technology. We talk about technology only in terms of computer and digitalization, etc. But Henry believed in traditional technologies as much as he believed in a role for participatory research to help young people tell their own stories. And that meant using drama, rap, poetry, whatever, these innovations that are part of outreach. And so when we look at technology now, the innovations that young people continue to bring to the table, are we creating? So I'm asking another question. Is there a space for those lessons, that research in a way that they are presented? are they valued in the decision-making processes across the Commonwealth, the UN, etc.? Because I think that is where we need to be making more significant accommodations.
Well, thank you very much for broadening the use of tools to the arts and the culture, and those non-traditional approaches, I think are quite useful. Kimberly, that question about the technology, how does the bank grapple with this going forward with your new strategy?
Thanks, Lane. As you can see, I am grappling with managing the technology. No, I think it's a critical question, Gemma. And of course, given where the bank is positioned and the work that the bank has to do, the issue of the digital divide continues to be one of those core issues that we grapple with. And certainly as it relates to social justice, the issue of digitalization and ensuring that if we work in accordance with the Sustainable Development Goal core principle of leaving no one behind, and importantly started with those who are furthest behind first, we recognize that there are some persons based on their identities, based on their locations, that tend to be left out of the digitalization, and there are threats of having them left further behind. I think if I look at where Henry's positioned, and I look at persons such as Robert Chambers, whose reality counts, it's really having young people at the center of the discussion and engaged in what was important as well, that intergenerational dialogue, because we have often a lot of talking heads about the solutions, but critically, we're not hearing from those persons who are most affected. So I don't have the answers. I know it's a key point of discussion, but whose reality are we seeking to address? How do young people want to be included? What are those emerging technologies? What are the traditional ways of engaging? And how do we find perhaps a multi-layered approach to ensure that we are able to treat with those issues of inclusion and participation in a way that meets the needs of those people we are trying to reach and involve?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing. So I guess what I'm picking out here is that as new and evolving issues arise in the Caribbean and the world on youth and children issues, we're going to have to take some of what Henry mentioned and some of those responses that you gave and apply them in the same way to deal with them. Of course, we will not have all the answer, but I think if we go by the principles that he has shared and the ideas, we can begin to see how we can treat with these issues. Another question, though, has come from those who are listening, and I'm not sure if Colleen can speak, but I'll phrase the question and would want her to add a bit on this. So Colleen's question to the panelists is, she's wondering whether there's some difference in working with youth based on gender, working with young men and working with young women. How did Henry in his approach treat with working with young men versus young women? And how do parents navigate with this? Colleen, if you're on and you want to elaborate on that question, please do feel free to do that. If not, I'll go to the panelists. Colleen?
Yeah, that's basically it. Thanks, yes.
All right, thank you. So we've heard from Colleen. Colleen, do you want to tell us a little bit more about you? How did you engage with Henry before the panelists take the question?
Okay, sure. I worked with Henry and Suzette in Sint Maarten. I'm from Parenting Partners Caribbean, and we helped to do the training of their PPSP facilitators and master trainers. We collaborated with UWI Open Campus, who did some of the initial research and lit review. And as Suzette mentioned, doing some focus groups with different individuals, different agencies, different with youth as well, to kind of get their perspectives on how they saw parenting in Sint Maarten and how they saw things, how they felt things should be in the future and what they were experiencing now. So that was my experience with Henry, and he certainly was very accommodating and very supportive throughout the entire process. But I'm listening as you all are talking, particularly about the youth development, and very often the parents are, when they become youth, teenagers going into young adulthood, that's when the hands get thrown up and it's very difficult to navigate. And so I'm just wondering, in terms of dealing with young men and working with young women, you know, are there differences, are there different approaches, and how that can inform parenting and overall family support?
Thank you so much for that excellent question and for your contribution here. Amilcar isn't on the call, would have been perfect to answer this question. You heard him, you know, speak very eloquently about gender issues being development issues. But perhaps let's have a go anyway. I'm going to start off with Kimberly. You know, in terms of the bank and looking at young men and young women, is there a difference in how Henry would have advocated to be treated with them and for parents?
I think that's a tough question. I think when we looked at the youth policy and operational strategy, these issues of gender and intersectionality and what it means in terms of access and opportunity came to the fore. And so what we looked at is that there is no homogeneity in terms of young men and young women. There's always these intersecting social categorizations and identities, and what it means. And sorry if I'm making it a bit more complicated, Colleen, but what it means to be a young woman from an Indigenous community who may live with a disability. And I think Terri-Ann brought up the point of where she's positioned as a Caribbean woman working at the Secretariat with a PhD, very different reality. And so again, I think it comes down to understanding how those intersecting realities create space or exclude particular groups, and treating with responses in a way that responds to where persons are positioned, to their lived experiences and opportunities. And so, of course, when we look at issues of safeguarding, we look at what is required to ensure that young men, young women can engage in a way that is safe and secure. We look at how we engage parents in a manner that creates that opportunity for dialogue, that creates those positive relationships as well. But I wouldn't say that we have a specific, again, one-size-fits-all approach for young men, one-size-fits-all approach for young women, but looking at the responses based on those awareness, that awareness of the intersecting realities that they experience.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that one. Intersectionality. I think Henry would have wanted to say there's young people are not, it's not one homogeneous group. It's actually quite a diverse group. And I think his ethos would have spoken to that. Another question from our those listening on, and we have just a few minutes, so I might just ask our panelists to just give short, quick answers so we cover as much as we can. So we have a question from question 3 from Talia or Maloney. I hope I got that right. And she's asking about, given the timeless quality of Henry's work, how can that knowledge that he has be captured, cataloged for future generations, essentially? So she's asking a question that says, listen, we're honoring Henry on this platform now, but in your own words, in your own thought, how do we preserve this knowledge, this body of work for future generations to also experience? I'm going to kick off here with Suzette. How would you do that in St. Maarten? And then I'm going to come to Terri-Ann. Short, quick answers.
Yeah, I think some of it will happen organically in terms of the compilation of the reports and different pieces of work from the project. So that's going to kind of happen organically. But I think probably as a team, we may make a more concerted effort to develop a catalog of all of Henry's work, sort of separate and apart from what we would post publicly related to the project.
Thank you so much. Terri-Ann?
Yes, this is excellent. And, this is something we're looking forward to discussing with Marjorie as well. Marjorie was not only Henry's wife, but also his collaborator on a lot of the work, the research work that was done on the Caribbean. We have volumes that we produce together that are out there. We need to do more promotion of the work done in these. But as a secretariat, we have the privilege of having a lot of the papers he wrote, interviews we did with him, webinars we had as a part of the Year of Youth, and we have those recordings. And there's a special anniversary initiative that we have, and we hope to be able to share some of those in a virtual exhibition sometime early next year. So that will be one opportunity to do some of it. But I would certainly welcome from Marjorie and other colleagues ideas on how we can best do that. I think that's a fantastic idea.
Thank you so much. And I think even this platform by SALISES could be something that they think about. And certainly in our work in the Secretariat, to have that Henry Charles room or virtual space would be one that people can go in and listen to some of the videos and his own imagery from his messages as well. So thank you so much for that wonderful question. And I hope you're still on to receive the answer as well. All right.
Lane,
Yes,
Lane,
please. Yes,
my
please.
apologies for jumping in like this. And I think I just wanted to begin where Terri-Ann ended, the recommendations. Young people like Tahila who raised that question, hearing from them as to how they would want to receive that information, I think is very important. So we welcome those suggestions from our young people out there so that it gives us an opportunity to respond in a way that is suitable, I think, and in a way that they would be receptive.
All right, thank you so much. I'm going to ask Ms. Eversley to take this question. So it's a question that comes from Audley, and I don't know if Audley is on the call and still wants to ask the question, but I'll phrase it first, and then if I've missed anything, you let me know. So we had spoken on this platform about Henry's work around national youth policies, Dwynette, and I know you've worked extensively on this as well. Audley is reporting that Bermuda is implementing their policy, but the question is there a gap analysis that can show what islands from the different Caribbean region have put in place on policies now? How do we engage domestic governments in taking on such initiatives and assigning real timelines to ensure that these kinds of policies are invoked or implemented? So the question is, how do we keep that pressure on to make sure that as the policies are created, they're actually implemented? I hope, Audley, if you're there, if I didn't ask it right, please do jump in and ask. Very, very powerful question. One I think Henry would have liked to have. Audley, before Dwynette takes the mic. Go ahead, Dwynette.
Congratulations on the Bermuda policy. I remember a lot of discussion a long time ago about Bermuda wanting a policy. And really, sometimes I think we underestimate the phenomenal job that the Commonwealth Secretariat has done in keeping youth policies centrally focused. The need for youth policies, governments should develop youth policies. And now youth policy is in the domain of discussion of young people. Yes, we want a youth policy, and we know that we are part of the development. There are a lot of good lessons about youth policy development, and Amilcar identified some. The Commonwealth has its own curation. Where are those? Those need to be more accessible to people. There also needs to be, whenever we approach youth policy, it's not a matter of doing a new youth policy, it's a matter of reviewing what happened and what did not happen, especially in the implementation. And I think, Lane, we need to have our own long forum on youth policies, especially the lack of political imperative for implementation and not just having a nice document to hold up. Here is my youth policy. I have no answer except to say we have to go further on it. We need our own specific forum, curate the best practices, review what worked, and look at what else needs to be done.
Absolutely. I think you've spoken very well. I think that's what Henry would have mentioned. I think, as Kimberly said, we have to stock take. We have to, and I think that's the question, the saying, we have to pause and say, are we doing the right things? Listen, our time is running out. We want to hear from Marjorie, her reflection. So I'm going to take the last few questions now, but I'm really eagerly wanting to hear from her myself. So I don't want to miss that time. But let me take just the last few questions that I have here in the chat, and I hope that our panelists can answer them. This one comes to us from Ruth. Ruth, I don't know if you're on the call. Do you want to just take this one for us very quickly, just to get some other voices in? Ruth? Not sure if Ruth can hear me. All right. We have 2 minutes left. Let me just paraphrase this one.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I was unmuted. Yes, excellent session. I'm really touched by everything that was shared. I had the opportunity to meet Dr. Henry at St. Lucia and Miss Kimberly. I cried the entire session that you spoke for you. I just have a question being asked like continuously by other Commonwealth youths is how can we upscale those youths that are already engaged in those projects at their homes? How can they be involved in the development of youth policies? Let's say if it doesn't exist as yet, but how can they follow? Like I believe the Caribbean Development Bank has provided such a good model for other development banks in other regions to adopt. And I think it's something that should be practiced across the Commonwealth member states. I'm thinking too big, maybe, but how can other Caribbean countries re-engage with the Commonwealth Secretariat to bring those youth programs and blue economy programs to their country?
Terri-Ann, you want to pitch on that one? So how does the Commonwealth engage those other countries in the region to carry on some of this work using models like the one that was done in the CDB?
In the CDB, you know, Ruth, is such an excellent question, but I think in a sense, I think you have the answer already. The answer was in your question, because you suggested that we look at the models and exchange ideas. What the CDB has done is really innovative. It's unusual for multilateral development banks to have taken this approach, and it's something that other regions need to look at. But we have to remember, I would say, that the Commonwealth Secretariat operates at the service of our member states. We need, what Henry kept saying about youth mainstreaming and co-creation, is we need to strengthen that relationship between the state and young people. So it's not about the Secretariat engaging you, but us finding a way to facilitate that better relationship between member states and young people on bringing them more into these blue charter, green economy, health, education, all of the developmental agendas in which young people need to be at the center as co-leaders of those agendas. And I think if we have more dialogue with you, Rose, I think we can come up with the right strategies, because I think you've hit the nail on the head.
Thank you very much. So the final question to all the panelists, and also by way of your summary, and I'll begin with Suzette here, is, so the question came from Lionel Remy, I think, is what intervention, so I'm going to phrase it a little bit now, add my own kind of close bit in it. In the year when the CARICOM is celebrating 50 years and the youth program is celebrating 50 years, a very interesting mix where Henry sits in the middle of the CARICOM and the Commonwealth, 50 years both. You know, Lionel is asking, what interventions does the panel consider effective when dealing with young people who are now caught in a cycle of drugs, gangs, and violence? This is where Henry's message must become clear. So the question is, in a year like this one, in a time like this, what we are living, 50 years CARICOM, 50 years Commonwealth Youth Program, what solutions would you think Henry would offer for a young person now caught in a real challenge now around gangs and violence? What would he say? This is the message of hope we want to conclude with for such persons. Suzette, what would Henry have said, or what interventions could have applied?
I think what Henry would have said would be to put those young people at the center of finding the solution.
Martin snaps it to the point. Kimberly, what would Henry have done?
I want to echo the sentiments Suzette shared, and I also want to just go back quickly to the positive youth development approach, looking at those 5 C's that we see in the work of Lerner and Pittman and others, looking at programs that build that connection, a feeling of safety and security for young people, that builds their confidence, self-worth, and mastery of what they're faced with, you know, that they have the capacity to succeed, looking at building character, taking responsibility, and a sense of independence and individuality. Competence, do they have the ability to act effectively where they're located? And also contribution, creating space for their active participation and leadership in the decision-making processes that impact them and their lives. So I think, you know, there are many things that could be said, and I think that would be a key intervention and some actions that could be taken.
Thank you so much. Dwynette?
Thanks, Lane. I think Henry would laugh very heartily, first and foremost, and say, oh, well, we found out the prisons did not work. And he would then say, the issue that we don't want to say, we don't want to talk about, is that we are not meeting human security needs. And human security is not crime and violence prevention, it's economic participation and access in corridors that have been traditionally denied to some of us because of how we look, which area we came from, in which community, etc. So it is that kind of inclusion that we need to discuss and we need to revisit. And what makes some of us legitimate and others not.
Absolutely. And then finally, Terri-Ann.
Yes, I just have to endorse everything my colleague panelists have said. And to add that, I think he would have first said, what do you think? And then he would have called some other people together and asked all of us, what is our responsibility to combat the violence of exclusion that has put these young people in these situations of violence? And what are we as a collective in partnership, in intergenerational partnership and as co-creators going to do about it?
Let me, on all of us who have stayed on, listen to the panelists, thank you all, including Amilcar, who is not on, for your excellent reflections on the life and work of Henry as an academic and intellectual in shaping youth work and youth development thought across the world and the Commonwealth. Let me thank you all for your individual wonderful presentations as well. And I think we will do well to receive those presentations as they're circulated. And thank you for the personal touch that you brought into the call as well. I wish we had more time, and I think we may need to invite you back, certainly SALISES and Commonwealth, to do maybe more reflection, because I think you have so much more to share, but time would not allow. But again, thank you for allowing yourself to share. It must have been difficult for you, I figure as much, but thank you for sharing, and we welcomed your presentation and your wonderful words and look forward to seeing how your words would help build the legacy that Henry would want to see happen in the world. Thank you so very much. The point in the whole program, when I received this program, that I really wanted to have is to hear from Marjorie myself. And Terri-Ann mentioned Marjorie being, you know, a co-laborer, someone who works alongside Henry, someone who helped Henry throughout. Marjorie, for her own self, has over 42 years experience of being in education, as being an educator, a Commonwealth scholar, has PhD in education, well learned in terms of psychology and many other, you know, aspects of human development. She has been involved in youth development right across the Commonwealth, as with Henry, and is now, I think, in her most recent capacity, is going to be serving as the principal of the Sir Arthur Lewis Community College. It's not, you would think it's some kind of strange thing that Sir Arthur Lewis Institute is doing this, and we have the principal of Sir Arthur Lewis Community College. But Marjorie, we want to thank you for taking the time to be a part of this call, and I know you would not have missed it. We want to hear from you now your own reflective thought on what we would have heard as a person who was closest to Henry, of all of us who, you know, you were there when his most intimate thoughts, his fears, his hopes, his aspirations. We want to hear from you now. Thank you so much for your own strength in being a part of this. And I hope that as you share with us, we will glean parts of Henry that we would not have heard from anywhere else. Thank you. Over to you.
Good afternoon, good everyone. Good evening, those of you who are in the UK. And good morning to those of you who are down under. Thank you very much for your opportunity for me to share some work, my reflections on Henry's work. And one of the things I want to say, first of all, is Henry one of the things Henry spoke a lot about, one of his favorite Creole. Those of you who listen to Henry, you would know that Henry speaks a lot of Creole, call everybody garçon, and so on and so forth. And one of the things, you know, many times we'd speak about is when somebody called him to ask him for stuff, and he would say, and he would call me. There are a number of ways he'd call me. When he called me my child, so I know it's a story he's going to give me. And one of his favorite phrase was "tig mo, maison tig la." What that means in our Creole, community is the tiger is dead, but his claws are still there. So in essence, Henry's legacy lives on, all right, as the tiger, even if he's not there in person, but his legacy lives on as Tig Zong Tig La. And I want to give you my reflections on Henry from my experiences. And I want to say one thing. I want to say it was a pleasure sharing Henry with the young people of the Commonwealth and the world, and also with the youth development workers. Now I'm just going to give you my reflection in pictures, and I'm just going to give you a little idea. Henry, the man, he was nurturing, understanding, he was positive, and he was generous. And the young people gravitated towards him. And in terms of his nurturing and understanding, Henry would be up 2 o'clock in the morning talking to Kendall or Tioka or Prunella, Amilcar, any one of the young people who'd call. And then he'd say, you know what happened? And and he always had an air for them. He spent lots of time. Sometimes I find 24 hours in the day were not enough for him, but he spent that time with them. He nurtured them. He spoke to them. In the Trinidad Palace, he buffed them, and he tell them off, and he tell them exactly what he thought about their behavior. But because of his generous nature and his positive and his understanding nature, the young people, it was like water on the duck's back, because the next day they would be back at him again, asking him for guidance and stuff, and he helped them a lot. He worked a lot. His fascinating life transcends boundaries and barriers. He was inclusive. His work was purposeful, and he always empathized with others. So you would see him walk with kings, with everybody, and he had that same kind of demeanor with whoever he spoke to, because that is the man Henry was. Henry, some of you may not know that Henry, the unrepentant trade unionist. He was the General Secretary of the Civil Service Association in St. Lucia. Confident, professional, understanding, militant. Henry was one of the pioneers. He led a 1995 strike. That was one of the longest strikes in St. Lucia. Teachers, public service, all of the people, because they were working for a collective bargaining and some issues that they had. And Henry was militant. He made lots of enemies that time because of the person he was and his principles. He did not give up. So much so that 1995 strike cost the government of the day. So they lost the elections in 1997. And Henry has been, and he still speaks about the rights of the workers. He's still passionate about that. He's still a passionate trade unionist. Also, Henry was committed to his colleagues. He loved Dwynette, he loved Terri-Ann, he loved Lane, Kimberly, Suzette, everybody. He used to tell me stories about everybody. He loved you all. And he was committed to all of you. If Dwynette call him today and she has an issue to me, no, I have to call Dwynette now, and he would sit and he'd speak to Dwynette for hours. He would call me and tell me I have to speak to Terri-Ann in a few minutes. And so everybody, so I knew everyone he was related to because of his passion, and he's committed to them. Okay? And you spoke a lot about him as being a visionary, and this is true. And I remember that the Prime Minister of St. Lucia spoke about that. Henry was a visionary. He gave his last work was the memorial lecture, the Gilbert-Charles Memorial Lecture, May 1st, where he was very, very, very critical of what was happening, and he gave them some sound advice. And he also, in his own way, used the calypso and the Creole and his hearty laugh. You'll hear him say ha ha ha, and all of these things to tell them what they should do to create a better space for us and a better space for the community. Also, the last things he did, which I have to help in St. Lucia, is that he was instrumental in developing a proposal to provide psychosocial support for the men, women, boys, and girls in one of the vulnerable communities in South St. Lucia. So right now because we worked as a team, I now have to take the baton and move and assist them in that particular thing. Henry was a father, a grandfather. His children love him. They love their dada. The grandchildren love their papa, their granddad, and not forgetting his four-legged child, who they all loved him. I always wonder how he gets the time to do all of these things and also make time for us, the family, but he made time for us also. So, as I'm saying again, Tigmore mit Zong Tigla. His legacy lives on. Rest in power, gentle giant. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you very much, Marjorie, for that very, very powerful and insightful reflection. I think if you were in an audience, we would be standing on our feet now just to say thank you. I really wanted to hear from you, and I think you've spoken in big tones. We want to just thank you now for that wonderful reflection. Very simple, very straightforward, but so powerful. Thank you so much for that reflection. And it speaks of your own love for us. And we hope that as you continue this journey without Henry by your side, you will see a bit of Henry in all of us being with you on that journey, that you can count on the memories that he has shared with us to bear you up when those times come when you are not feeling as strong as before. Let me thank you, but the job of thanking you and the others is not mine. It's for Sophia King. She is a former research assistant at SALISES St. Augustine and a PhD candidate sociology, UWI. Sophia, vote of thanks for you. Over to you.
Thank you, Chair. As a past student of Dr. Henry Charles, I feel honored to have the opportunity to do a vote of thanks for this special event on empowering people and institutions, youth work, youth development, and celebrating the legacy and life's work of Dr. Henry Charles. On behalf of SALISES, UWI St. Augustine, I would like to extend my sincere thanks and appreciation to the chairperson and the panelists. Thank you, Mr. Lynn Robertson, Head of Social Policy Development at the Commonwealth Secretariat, for your role as chairperson for this event that celebrates Dr. Henry Charles' legacy. We appreciate your support. In addition, I would like to thank all the panelists for the impactful presentation and tribute to Dr. Charles' work. Thank you, Dr. Terri-Ann Gilbert Roberts, Mr. Amilcar Sanatan, Ms. Dwynette Eversley, Ms. Suzette Moses-Burton, and Ms. Kemberley Gittens. In addition, I must thank our audience for their continuous support and engagement. Thank you for attending this special event to celebrate and honor Dr. Henry Charles. Also, a special thanks to the SALISES team, Ephraim Thompson, Shalom Warner, and Kathy-Ann Modest for organizing this event. And many thanks to Wendy Maynard, Roseanne Green, and Chanel Glasslow from the UWI Marketing and Communication team for all their assistance in the planning stages of this event, especially the wonderful artwork. Furthermore, I would like to extend my heartfelt thanks to Dr. Marjorie Jameson-Charles for your reflective thoughts, which was a beautiful contribution to this webinar celebrating your husband's life, work, and memory. We send our condolences, prayers, support, and love to you and your family during these hard times. So we all must thank the Godfather, and we must thank the Godfather of youth work and youth development studies, Dr. Henry Charles, for his great contributions. Dr. Henry Charles' life work will forever have a strong impact on the Caribbean region and worldwide, especially among his colleagues and students in the field of social policy, youth work, and youth development, who have all expressed their desire to preserve his memories, celebrate his achievements, and follow in his footsteps. Thank you, Dr. Henry Charles, and rest in peace. Lastly, thank you to Dr. Godfrey St. Bernard, the Acting Director of SALISES, for hosting this event to honor Dr. Charles' legacy, and for using these webinars, seminars, and online platforms to bring awareness and raise discussions on critical issues affecting Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean. Thank you all for being here and for celebrating a legend, an icon, Dr. Henry Charles. And now Dr. St. Bernard will give the closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to you, Safia, for that wonderful vote of thanks. And it's just another expression of giving youth a voice in a forum that really celebrates a champion for youth work and youth development. As Safia said, she worked with Dr. Henry. She was a student of Dr. Henry Charles, and she worked closely with his wife, Marjorie Jameson Charles, on a project all of us worked on in SALISES St. Augustine. So kudos to you, Safia, for a job well done. I also want to express my own personal heartfelt thanks to the panelists who agreed at relatively short notice to participate in this event. And of course, the head of the Social Policy Unit in the Commonwealth Secretariat, Mr. Lean Robinson, for his astute management and oversight of the proceedings today. I want to thank all of you for making this another successful event hosted by SALISES, and in this case, in collaboration with the Commonwealth Secretariat. I also want to express my sincerest thanks to the audience who have shown up virtually, and many names I recognize as constant supporters of all of our SALISES events. So I want to thank you, as well as all other entities who were thanked by Ms. Safia King. In closing, I just want to make a quick announcement. On the 1st of September, at the same time, we are hoping to install a new seminar series that will be hosted by SALISES. It's entitled SALISES Visitors Webinar, and we are hoping on that event, to feature Mr. Hayden Gittens, who will be speaking on private framing as a driver of regional economic development. Mr. Gittens has had a long and productive professional life as a financial professional in the banking sector, not only here in Trinidad and Tobago, but he has also served in Jamaica and in St. Lucia. And I can trust you, you will be really engaged in a serious way by his presentation. Towards the end of September, we are also hoping to host another visitor, and I'm still negotiating with him. He's Mr. Sekou Remy, and most likely he will be speaking on the issue of big data, artificial intelligence, among other high-tech issues related to the data revolution. And once we are speaking about anything related to development trusts, SALISES is at the forefront in terms of leading the charge. So I am alerting you as to these two events, and I wish to inform you that as of the end of September, I will be retiring from the university. So I think, I want at this point in time to begin expressing my thanks to all who have supported the virtual SALISES forums, the series that we have had. I may try to host one last one just to make it 20 on the list, and that one most likely will feature presentations addressing the issue of young men in Caribbean societies and what is actually happening to young men in our Caribbean societies. So with that, I thank everyone, and I wish you the very best for the rest of the day, and do have an enjoyable weekend. Thank you very much to all. It has been my pleasure.
Thank you. One love.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.